Well, I don't think anyone here will deny that Syria kind of looks like a second-rate dive bar, where you got a bunch of people who don't want inside that building. I think that the first primary goal then are not really the things that our opening government has identified. Sure, they're attainable, we want them, but they're merely superficial. The primary thing we want is some kind of political stability that is foreseeable in the region. And I think that the policy that our current government side has proposed really doesn't do the job very well. Now, before I go on into explaining my three arguments, I would like to offer some points of response to what the government said. Well, first of all, I dealt with the goal, so let's go to these so-called violent and untrustworthy groups. We do deny that no single one of these factions that fight for dominance in the region is that trustworthy. But then again, neither is Assad. We don't think that just because he has a seat of power in government automatically makes him a more stable and reliable actor. We think that the Syrian war has degraded all parties to the same level to the extent that nobody can be trusted. And this is one of the major points that will be explained in our first argument. So they have to explain why exactly to us why Assad is a sustainable actor in the region that the US can at least trust a bit more. Please sit down. Next, they have this half-assed presentation as to why Afghanistan and Iraq are remarkably different, and that this will be more like a sustainable pullout in the manner of Iraq, but not without the consequences of Iraq. I think that, first of all, Deputy Prime Minister Trump here give us an exact explanation as to why the situation in Iraq and Syria are so different. You have so many warring factions, and in fact, they are more militarized, more radicalized in the Syrian situation right now, and especially when the war against ISIS is almost over, but you still have a lot of terrorist cells vying for that sweet spot in the Middle East. We don't think that we can trust ourselves without having any kind of US presence, and therefore the power vacuum will still be left. More importantly, this is not a power vacuum in that there is no power, power in the area. It's just that there is no dominant power that everybody fears. Without the US, you're only going to have similarly matched, similarly powered factions vying for this kind of control. So, to go on into our arguments. About the relapse of war. Again, the first priority on the opposition side is to prevent another war from happening. Number one, a war against ISIS, because unless they come up. But second, more importantly, a relapse of the Syrian civil war itself. So, our primary goal is to ensure Syria's nation building in a manner that does not cause undesirable side effects or negative externalities. The first aspect of this argument is we will not allow Assad's power to be consolidated, not only because of the various reasons that the US doesn't want Assad because it's an untrustworthy actor and that he's responsible for so many human rights violations, but on a more practical level, that basically if Assad's power is consolidated, the Syrian democratic forces are going to use Damascus as a replacement of the US. They're going to go to an extremely fast solution to ask Assad to guarantee their protection and amnesty, and so it legitimizes Assad's territorial expansion into SDF-controlled areas. Now, the second level of this analysis is how exactly Damascus exercises influence over SDF and to another extent other rebels like the YPF's lands. Well, two levels of analysis here. Number one, that because they have so many crude oil areas that the SDF has and Assad wants at the end of the day, Damascus will try to use their power in the absence of the US to say, we will protect you in exchange for ceding the lands that are rich in crude oil that the SDF controls. Second level of analysis, because with the absence of power to the US and a party that can actually refer to, the SDF will most likely reach Damascus first and ask for a buffer zone to be created by ceding their territory on the Turkish border, because they are extremely afraid of Erdogan's extremely aggressive policies that will eliminate the SDF. So they will purposely cede. Do you think I'm just postulating? No. These negotiations are already going through, already happening right now, and they have been in contact with Damascus. Third level of analysis. Ultimately, they will push out the SDF. What will this lead to? Turkey will get what they want. Turkey and the United States of America has been negotiating for a very long time, not only over weapons deals, but economic deals that many people have accused Trump for as a backwater negotiation where they have simply cast away and sacrificed their allies by the Kurds in the SDF. So what does this normally get if you look at the bigger picture? You have another party that is still infinitely involved in the crisis, that another party whose vested interest is in Syria. And because there is no overwhelming power that can keep both at bay, this leads to war. We don't think that this will do any good to stop the war in the crisis because you have Russia, Iran, and Turkey involved in the area, and the US should not want out of this. The second level of analysis is going to be how it will help fighting the war itself. Now, again, as they conceded, the war is almost over, but it's not entirely over. So we still need some kind of military presence there to ensure that future wars do not happen. Three levels of analysis. The first is we need to prevent the desperate use of asymmetrical warfare. I think that we completely agree with their characterization when they say that these small factions are radicalized. They can resort to very extremely irrational and very immoral things. So what will they do? They might use underage fighters. They might use asymmetrical weapons in the exact fashion that Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons against his own population. I mean, any country that has been at a a war and suddenly lost an important ally or a common source for military power, has been able to resort to these kind of radical measures that basically endangers everybody. So we need to prevent their radicalization because the Kurds extremely enjoy the U.S. presence in that area. The second level of analysis is going to be at the presence of a ground contingent. Now, if we had a better opening government who knew exactly about military tactics, they would have explained to us that because it is not an air base and there's no combative element inside the U.S. regiment over there, that you don't really need this base to further U.S. military goals. The fact of the matter is, by the fact that they have special force operational detachments in that area means that you have communications presence, you have supply lines, and at least a basic amount of military force to gather intel and push U.S. interests in the area. So you do need a stable ground force. War is ultimately won on the ground, not in the skies. Please sit down. The third level of analysis is that the U.S. continually needs to check terror cells that are funded by Iran. Sure.
Okay, but the United States doesn't have boots on the ground in the status quo. We support it via Air Force. So according to
it does have boots on the ground. 2,000 Special Force Green Berets are in the ground right now. I mean, you got to check your facts on this. So, third level of analysis, they're going to check the terror cells that are funded by Iran and be able to check other parties. Finally, the third argument is going to be about the trust of America. Why is trust a concept that is so wishy-washy, so important? In democratic nations, and when people assess a country, trust is most important. Because the Trump administration is losing that trust, it needs to show at least some kind of commitment. First, in the town of Manji, which is basically the town where American presence is pretty big, the Kurd fighters trust the U.S. They want that U.S. presence. So to them, it is a morale booster, and it provides them with important training information that they could not fight the war without. So if we really want to change the hearts and minds of people on the ground, which has been a U.S. failure in Afghanistan and Iraq, you need to have that U.S. presence to assure their presence. The second is about Turkey. When Turkey and the United States of America engaged in this field, they already sold Patriot 3 anti-air missile batteries to Turkey, and the rest of the world isn't really going to watch this happen. So unless people want to accuse America of having backwater deals with Turkey, this needs to stop. Third, when NATO, especially France and Britain, don't want the United States to pull out right now, we don't think that it is possible, considering NATO-U.S. relations at the point for the U.S. to simply say we're going to do what we want again. Now, the fourth one is the Middle Eastern actors, especially after the United States war powers resolution that limits coalition forces and they're just from refueling by American aerial tankers. We don't think that the regional actors will be happy about America's focus on internal politics. We think that this will worsen the war in Yemen and in these areas. For all these reasons, very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. I would now like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
About Syria. It's not enough to say that the US has specific strategic interests in the region that they should try to further at the sake of Syrian civilian lives. Because what we need to recognize in this debate, the comparative that goes unengaged with that we bring to you from the Prime Minister's speech, we tell you that leaving too late can destroy a country. Leaving too late can lead to a situation like Afghanistan where you basically never get stability, you never get peace, and you screw over every civilian in that country. They need to engage with that comparative and not just throw a bunch of military jargon at us in an American accent and pretend like that's an argument. A couple of things in this speech. I'll be responding to the points that we get from the European opposition and pointing out that they really don't have a clear case in this debate, because they say a lot of things about how the Kurds will feel, about how some internal people will feel, but this is fundamentally about the US pulling out of Syria. They specifically tell us what they think the role of the US should be in this area, rather than just saying, well, it would be nice for certain rebel groups if they had some more weapons. Sure, that's probably true of any rebel group. Why is it the US that needs to stay, given that we've already previously why it's likely that that presence is destabilizing? And then finally, I'll be dealing with a contribution that we give you on opening government and showing you why that's the most important thing in this debate. So, let's talk about Assad and his power consolidation. A couple of things to recognize here. They don't want it. Why is it worse if the US stays involved? I think the first thing to recognize is a somewhat proxy war that is currently happening between the US and Russia within Syria. Because the problem is that Russia is trying to use this as a way to look powerful in the international community. As soon as the US does something in favor of a rebel group, Russia tries to counter that by funding Assad. So fundamentally on their side, it gets worse if they care about Assad power consolidation, because ultimately when the US does more for these rebel groups, Russia does more to give Assad more weapons, to give Assad more funding, so he's able to consolidate power better under Assad, where the US continues to engage Syria. Moreover, they don't recognize that Assad is pretty much consolidated power anyway, right? They don't recognize the reality of this debate. This isn't 2011 anymore. It's been 7 years of brutal conflict, and Assad has basically been able to wipe out most rebel groups. So what that means is that he's probably already got as much power as he's going to get. So any kind of power consolidation they think that we're going to cause is probably marginal at best. But secondly, they said, well, people are going to now turn in favor of Assad because at least he's there. I think the important thing to recognize is these are the people who rose up against Assad in the first place. It's unlikely that random civilians are just going to go for Assad just for the sake of supporting Assad. Instead, what's likely to happen is that there is going to be increasing pressure for something like a negotiated settlement, right? Because it's clear that the war isn't going to be won in a way that's favorable to the civilian population, right? It is unlikely to end anytime soon. The problem in the status quo is that, one, a lot of these negotiations were hindered by the fact that ISIS exists. We think it's now the perfect time to pull out militarily because ISIS has been diminished, analysis, and again went unresponded to. But secondly, we think that because the US is currently so engaged in Syria, because they've funded so many different rebel groups, it's hard to help facilitate negotiations. That's why the international communities, they're very often accused of being biased in terms of favoring their own interests. If they actively disengage and say, this isn't our fight, but we will help you facilitate negotiations, they put them in a much better stance in terms of negotiating a settlement with the Assad government and actually bringing an end to the war and hopefully having something like a democratic election. That's much more likely on the outside when it doesn't look like they're trying to further their own military and strategic interests like the opening opposition wants to discuss in this debate. I think this is the perfect time to do so because of the way that ISIS has been removed, because of the way that threat is now gone. So we believe that this is the best time to further that negotiated settlement. But then let's discuss this kind of fringe idea that they give us in terms of the abuses of power in terms of using chemical weapons and child soldiers. I think the first thing to point out here is that any actor that is so nefarious to do so will do that anyway, right? Please see Assad himself. So it's unclear why the US presence itself is actually deterring any kind of these actions. Moreover, we have multiple mechanisms to deal with this if it happens, right? So we have things like the ICC, we have things like international tribunals which we can set up in a situation where we find out that these things happen. It's unclear why the US specifically is deterring this kind of action more. Moreover, we think that they're actually more likely to cause this kind of action, right? Because it's easy to radicalize people if you have such a clear enemy like the US. When you point out the West is evil, so you should fight for us. It's more likely that you get these kind of abuses of power and radicalization on their side, where the US is still actively involved, whether it be boots on the ground or whether it be drones that make children afraid of blue skies. Lastly, let's discuss US strategic interests. I think the first thing to recognize here is they give us absolutely no principled justification for why the US should be allowed to royally fuck up Syria for the sake of their own strategic interests. They need to do a lot more work to show us why that should be fair. But secondly, and as our closing rightly points out, most of the intervention is by air anyway, so it's unclear what strategic interests they are actively furthering within this debate. But finally, we think, in terms of US strategic interests, we believe that it would be better to not be fighting a proxy war against Russia. We believe that not only is it diminishing the safety of the international community in that they are able to have some sort of military conflict with each other, but it is also harming our ability to have a negotiated settlement. It's harming our ability to undermine the Assad government, because whatever the US does to support rebel groups, Russia just counters that by supporting Assad. So fundamentally, this war is unwinnable on the US side. It's unwinnable for basically any side. So we need to be pushing for a side of negotiations. We do that through disengagement. So why is our contribution most important in this debate? Again, they don't recognize that this disengagement is particularly necessary for the specific timing of this debate. We told you specifically here about things such as instability. They try to tell us that rebel groups are incredibly strong as a stand. Fundamentally untrue. That's just not the case, right? As soon as ISIS was defeated, a lot of these groups, so in the fight against ISIS, a lot of these groups became factionalized. They lost a lot of support to ISIS itself, but no one's been able to diminish ISIS significantly. They have almost no land left. But that also means that these rebel groups themselves have lost a lot of their fighters. They've lost a lot of support. Lots of people have fled to other areas. What this means is that these groups aren't very strong, and also a lot of the harms that the leader wants to raise you on the case. Moreover, because the fighting has gone on so long, a lot of people have either left the country or are no longer fighting in this war. So we think that this instability that they think is going to be caused by a power vacuum will not be the case. So this isn't an Iraq situation. This is instead likely to be a situation like Afghanistan, so we need to leave now. But secondly, let's talk. We also mentioned about. They also kind of mention these ideas about Assad's power, and I think the important thing to recognize that's not our burden in this debate. Right? Our burden in this debate is not to say the alternative is Assad, because it's not. The alternative is not engaging at all. The alternative is not being involved. Right? They specifically tell you at the beginning of the speech why no one is trustworthy. It is unclear then why we should be aligning ourselves with certain individuals. It's unclear why we should be supporting different groups within Syria. Everyone is so untrustworthy. So, what does open government give you in this debate? We should tell you why this is the worst thing possible for Syria. We show you why this is bad for international relations in terms of the proxy war between the US and Russia, and how this is terrible in terms of the situation that it creates for Syria going forward. You must stand for the open government.
So, is there a way we can turn the ACO?
I think open the way. Yeah, strongly agree.
So that one is long, I think. But this one is not open. Okay, background. Ooh, this is a nice breeze actually. Thank you very much. To continue the case and to close the opening half of this debate, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
OG tells us that you can stay too long, but you can also stay too short. Thereby, they can see that there is a golden metric in which you're staying just enough. I think the problem with OG's case is it never tells us why the US has fulfilled those metrics. I think there are two clear metrics that the US must see in status quo in order to leave. Firstly, that the situation here is that firstly there's no clear, overwhelming military power, which means that if the US does leave, obviously there is a power vacuum because no one is going to be so strong that you're all willing to surrender to them automatically. But secondly, there's no clear consolidation of power in the status quo, where anyone who likes Assad is very begrudging, they like him, they still remember the fact that he used chemical weapons on his own people. So even if Assad is in power and does have a bigger military, that doesn't necessarily mean post-war conflict, there will still be political stability. There are a couple of unique things that the US acts as a unique influencer. Not just in the fact that they're the biggest economy, or that they're the biggest arms dealer, that they have the most advanced military, like yes, Russia exists, but like Russia is in an economic downturn compared to the United States. So clearly, the United States is the vacuum that you want. So they ensure a huge power instability and military power in the region, who they endorse. But secondly, the unique stature of where the context of this debate is happening. I can't understand why OG never recognizes that, like in the context of Trump, where the Trump administration says, Assad, I will let you remain in power, where Trump and Russia aren't engaging in Cold War, where they have thawing relations. When they have this situation on one side, in the other situation they have rebels who have relied on them for a long time, but also the US has to recognize that they have to consolidate their trust for the rebels, that they can't abandon them to Syria, because that means in the future, no one is going to trust US involvement because they believe that they'll be thrown away at once. So US has very clear interest to help both sides and reach a peace negotiation. That is a political stability that is guaranteed under opening opposition. A few things that I want to talk about in this debate. Firstly, we'll go over the things about how there's the idea that there's not much harm in leaving. Ideas about harm and staying too long. Firstly, the questions that OG raises are this. Does the US still need to keep a military presence? And their reasoning is that ISIS is gone and therefore there's no more war. But the thing is, ISIS is gone largely, but in its place you have multiple rebel groups who are strong enough to kick ISIS out. Which means that there are multiple groups that are still armed, that have very vastly different ideologies, and as Andy has already told you multiple times, there's people like Kurds who have very clear cultural and ethnic identities that they're unlikely to consolidate into a single power overnight. What does this mean? It means that if you leave, two things happen. One, a retribution to rebel groups that were previously pro-US, like rebel groups that were supported by the US, now stripped of their power, now suddenly having no way to gain the few weapons that are allowing them to exist, means that there's going to be a lot of damage upon them. So not only is this a damaging of trust in the United States, which I'll explain why it's harmful, but also it's actual harm to individuals who have trust in the US. So if you want to do a comparison or a principle about why the US has an obligation to stay, I think clearly they have an obligation to stay and make sure these people aren't entirely fucked over. But secondly, that there's a fraction of allegiances. That right now in the status quo, all sides are somewhat agreeing that yes, the US is not actually pro-Assad, but they are still supporting Assad, but of course they have reasons to keep the rebels under their own umbrella. That means that there is still essential idea about which political direction we want to head in and how we're going to approach peace talks. But the US pulls out, that means Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, everyone who hates the Kurds and wants to take control of Saudi Arabia and its oil reserves, now have a very direct incentive to go into this. Unlike the United States, who has vast majority power, where everyone will agree that the US is the strongest actor in this debate, all these other nations, every faction will have different people they want to follow. That's why there's a detracting allegiances and more conflicts will happen. So the US is keeping a peacekeeping role, not because they're fighting ISIS, but they're making sure a worse situation doesn't happen. Secondly, is there a power vacuum? And this is the reason why they say oh, US can leave, because there is a power vacuum. That's their explanation for Afghanistan.
okay, one, like they say, well, there's no one worse than Assad, but like I think Assad himself is pretty worse. Like the fact that he uses chemical weapons, but the fact that no one likes him as well, which means that if Assad is alone without the US's check, I think he's wildly unpopular, meaning that unless like there's some magical way in which he can consolidate political power, people are still going to hate him, and eventually someday he'll make everyone want to beat him as well. But secondly, understand this: the U.S. telling Assad you can stay in power implies that as long as you do what is in line with U.S. interests, which is create peace in the Middle East, not to do anything crazy that destabilize the situation again, they're okay with backing Assad. Which means Assad also understands that he can't do things like chemical weapons or killing his own people, or else he'll create another war where the U.S. is again doing things against him. So in the status quo, there's clear incentive to Assad to also not do the kind of terrible things that they're talking about. So in this case, like ultimately though, even if we accept this case is the best, all they're explaining to us is that why there's no harm in leaving. That doesn't necessarily explain to us the harm in staying. And this is the second point we want to go to. The only actual problem they give us is that the US might stay too long. I think this is a very vague harm. Like, what exactly is staying too long? So it feels like Afghanistan, but clearly Afghanistan is different. Like, Afghanistan was like nation building, it was more counterterrorism in response to like 9/11 attacks. This is an entirely different situation. But also, I think Afghanistan is just proof that the US does have clear failures in its past, and they're able to learn from them. If you do these things poorly, then you're going to have huge problematic legacies that damage the Middle East. So obviously, I think there is some situation here. But OG is also conceding here that there is some idea that you should be staying up. What exactly do you think is the metric of staying up? And here's where we mechanize a lot of these things. Firstly, the idea of military strength and stability is needed. So when there's like no faction that is overwhelmingly strong, then you need like some kind of support and like military support. So like there's clear U.S. influences on current Turkey and Syria to promote some kind of peace. Here is the response to like the idea that SEAL comes up with. Like the U.S. can still have plane flights. Like firstly, like 2,000 U.S. soldiers is a lot of soldiers, but the U.S. doesn't just do this. They provide things like weapons that are vastly more technological advantage, which allows Kurds to fight for their freedoms, even though they might be similarly crushed in like a futile defense. Otherwise, they also offer things like military tacticians, and they also, and this is very important, stabilize war tactics, because the Kurds know if they use like child soldiers or use like indiscriminate killing of civilians, the U.S. is probably not going to feel justified in helping them, which is if they leave, they're going to be so desperate they have to resort to any measures, and probably that means they will resort to the worst measures in order to survive. Yes?
So you seem to be worried about there being a power vacuum, but Assad has consolidated power significantly. The last rebel stronghold was like a siege last month. So what do you think is the solution here?
The power vacuum isn't just a military power vacuum, although I think Andy has given you extensive reasons why there are military power vacuums when the US leaves and they're more centralized inside. The power vacuum is also a political power vacuum. The fact that these warring factions still have very significant reasons to hate each other, the US is the sole actor in the middle who's able to go through all the other actors. If the US leaves, then what are the alternatives? People turn to Turkey, people turn to Russia, people turn to Iraq. None of them have very real reasons in order to make sure that the Kurds and other rebel groups who used to be pro-US are incorporated directly back into the fold. We think they're only setting up the stage for another world where fights are going to go further on. I think the problem that Andy also told you, and uniquely told you, is the idea about regional politics. That this isn't just about what happens to Syria, because they said, right, we should think about the whole world. He told you what happens to countries around Syria, how Turkey reacts, how Turkey is going to see the Kurdish threat on their border. That was being protected by the United States, but now the United States is gone. So there's more escalation of warfare on that front as well. I think ultimately, if you want any sort of political consolidation in Syria, I think it's all that you stand on, none of you. Thank you.
And that concludes the opening round of this debate. I would like to welcome the member of government to continue for the government.
In the status quo, we exist within a stalemate of violence in which both sides continue to hurt one another, create more and more harm to one another in order to establish themselves as the legitimate rulers of Syria. According to the opening opposition, we have incentive by U.S.-owned standards, according to United States principles and United States interests, to maintain victory. However, they fail to say why it is that at the worldwide level, the regional-wide level, or even necessarily at the Syria-wide level, that is a good thing, nor how it is by staying in this particular region, we will actually get that metric. They provide some metrics that say that we fail to actually provide it on our side of the house, but then they completely ignore them in providing their own evidence. I'm going to prove this in a couple of points of rebuttal, and then show how it is that if we stay in the status quo, all we're going to see is increases of violence and an unsustainable system of bargaining process, and then secondly, why it is that a post-conflict Syria, according to our model, is much more likely to be solvent in the long run. First, moving into points of rebuttal. First of all, they bring forward this idea of radical measures, i.e. chemical warfare, oppression of the people, etc., etc. Now, first, I'd like to point out that the escalation of Assad's actions, yes, he wasn't a great ruler before all the Arab Spring, but it exponentially got worse during this conflict. So we assume that if the conflict settles, even in favor of Assad, we are more likely to see a return to that particular metric. So if we are faced in a world in which we have the metrics of either a stalemate in which violence continues as it is currently in the status quo, or see a return to the former Syria with less violence, even if it's under Assad, we believe that to be the case. Additionally, they fail to explain why it is specifically the mandate of the United States to uphold a mandate against chemical warfare when we have other alternatives, such as international institutions, which have demonstrated to be much more helpful and much less politically motivated than the United States in its support for actors simply because they have oil. So moving on to their second point, this idea of 2,000 boots on the ground. Now, first of all, again, this is not actually soldiers that are fighting. These are here purely in a training capacity. They're not actually helping hold any ground, which means that with regards to actually fighting back Assad, nothing is actually happening. We're just causing bombing, which is inherently aggressive warfare and doesn't lead to any sort of long-term solvency. With regards to their argument regarding power vacuum and resolution, first of all, they don't see how it is that we get a resolution. If we stay, we only see that Assad might not use chemical weapons further, which is currently the status quo, but also is the status quo before the war began. Also, we can see that a harmful stalemate, that whole argument. Finally, they bring forward this idea that that Assad will be held accountable by U.S. powers and threats. And they fail to explain why it is that these threats of potential power can't exist in a position in which we've withdrawn. In the current status quo, we do have the ability to use alternative things such as sanctioning, such as bombardment, in the cases of violation. But we have no reason to believe that those violations would continue should the conflict end. So if on government side, we can show you that the conflict would in fact come to an end, we're not actually going to have to resort to the methodologies that they necessarily suggest. Moving on to the argument with regards to conflict dynamics. Basically, why if we stay it gets worse. This has already been touched on by opening government, but I want to provide the mechanisms by which we actually can see this and extend that into the back half in such a way that that argumentation can actually be considered relevant to today's round. Given specifically the idea of bargaining, conflict as a bargaining process. Basically, this political science theory states that the majority of conflicts happen because of crises of information. It's basically a bargaining process between two sides in which neither side particularly wants to have conflict. But at the end of the day, if one side can't decide that it's going to be the strongest one and the other side recognize that, there will be conflict because both believe that there's a viable option in which either of them wins. What does this mean? It means that there is conflict because of information failures. What does this mean? This means that in a situation where there is no clear, strong actor, we are more likely to see violence. In the status quo, it is recognized that at a domestic level, Assad is much stronger than the freedom fighters. However, U.S. presence supporting these freedom fighters makes that power disparity less clear. It makes it so that neither side has a clearly defined edge in who's going to win this. Why is this important? Because it incentivizes both sides to act upon more violent, aggressive actions in order to establish their strength, as well as to make it additionally costly for the other side to continue engaging. It is because of this power disparity that bargaining cannot take place, because both sides believe that they have a reasonable ability to win. However, the freedom fighters simply don't have this because they don't have the domestic ground support to be able to hold territory, as was already pointed out in my argumentation. First, from Tom.
Oh, thanks. So, according to this logic, what kind of intelligence clemency on the Turkish part will prevent them from going to war with the Kurdish elements in Syria?
Simply because in the status quo we already have these tensions pre-existing. It's not the United States' presence existing there so much as the threat of the Kurds within Turkey falling away and joining the Kurds within Syria. If a conflict is resolved within Syria, we're not going to have that falling away from the Kurds. Therefore, the Turkish are less likely to feel, Turkey is less likely to feel a threat from the Syrian Kurds and from the Kurds within their own territories. Moving on into the idea of moral hazard. This connects to this because if we consider the example of the Arab Spring, for instance, In the original days of the Arab Spring, the United States backed the elements that were rebelling against their powerful oppressors. What was the result? We saw that other countries equally rebelled, and the United States failed to actually support them or were unable to support them. That is why Syria is in the position that it is currently. That is emblematic of what's going on right now. It's an instance of moral hazard, in which we are, in a way, backing the more risky gambling actions of an element that is less likely to win, because they know that if they do lose, they have this element of support behind them that makes their risk less costly to themselves. This is incredibly harmful because they're more likely to take risky action that leads to enhanced violence. My final point is with regard to solvency in the long term, and this is important because this is something that needs to be clarified. Why is it that not only if we stay it's going to get worse, but if we leave it gets better? And that's because of post-conflict. Specifically the idea of Western agendas. In the status quo, solvency in the long term is simply impossible. We can see this throughout history. When was the time that the United States or a Western power writ large getting involved in the Middle East actually resulted in good things for the Middle East? It rarely, if ever, happens simply because Western agendas and Western values are fundamentally not proportional and not reconcilable with this. We can look at who the United States picks as its actors for that. Specifically the SDF. It's because we want their oil. With regards to this need for U.S. presence and need to keep Syria in a place that is compatible with United States interests, it is this model of westernization that inherently means that long-term solvency isn't actually affordable. Unity cannot be attained simply because United States policy is simply incompatible with that of the domestic level. As such, we will continue to see fractiousness and conflict spread throughout the region in such a way that we have solvency in the long term unavailable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To continue the case for opposition, I'd like to welcome the opposition member.
When disengaging from Syria, there are two main things we would like to achieve. Gain regional stability and the well-being of the Syrian state. We don't think these things are going to be achieved, and even though the interest of the United States is not the most important thing of this debate, we believe this falls on our side. Our case is going to tell you two main things. First, it's going to talk about the important role of regional and external powers in the conflict and in the well-being of citizens of Syria and how it would change. But secondly, we're going to talk to you about the consequences of disengagement. Because opening government only talks about the US pulling out their military forces, unfairly ignoring the fact that disengaging also means cutting political and economic ties. We are going to talk about these things. But first, let's bring on some rebuttal. Because we need to remember the reasons why not the US but also NATO engaged in the situation and in the conflict. Yes, ISIS was one of the reasons, but just because ISIS is weaker now is not enough reason to pull out, as Prime Minister says. We also need to remember that there are Palestinian militants in the territory that the US wants to fight against, that Hezbollah is also a very strong power there that has become even more powerful, but also that even before these international powers were participating, the regime was being very aggressive towards Syrian citizens. So the presence of tanks and assassinations of people that were against the regime were present. So no, what happens that the regime is not going to be violent when we pull out won't happen because it was violent even before we were there. Also, we can accept the fact that there is going to be less violence in the way we are seeing it, but in the long term, we think there is going to be more violence when we have a violent regime that's killing and attacking without mercy its people, but also when we tell and send the message that it's okay to be a terrorist, that we're going to, in the end, give up the fight, and that giving protection to those terrorist groups is fine. So in the long term, we're going to see more of this type of violence, which we believe is even less humane, and we should care about this more. They tell us, and both teams talk about the importance of negotiation and the power of having bargaining. Let's know, and let's be very clear about the fact that in order to have successful negotiations, both parties need to have a similar amount of power. Let's take, for example, the case of the Cuban missiles in the Cold War. So what happened is that Russia was threatening severely the United States, but the United States was threatening as much Russia. So when we both are threatening each other, it's more likely for there to be an effective negotiation. Now, what happens if the US pulls out? That now I'm not a threat for you, now I'm not a threat in the region, I'm not attempting towards what you want, so why would you negotiate with me to worry about. So we believe that in this situation, we have more power to have negotiations, and we have seen that some negotiations have actually happened in the status quo. And they also tell us how there's going to be more regional stability, which we believe is not true. Why is that so? Because how the region is interacting right now and the way in which some players in the region are acting depends strongly on how the United States is acting. So, for example, some states, such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia, that have been partners of Syria, decided to stop having this relation with Syria just because the United States decided to go there. So we see that how things are happening in the region depends on the fact that the United States is there. We would see that changing. But also we believe that Syria could become a very threatening state because it would have a negative regime that's oppressing people, but also that's supporting terrorism. So when we have a state like this, that is a safe haven for this type of people, where they can go to, we see that there's even more threats in the region. Okay, let's move on to our first points, because it's important to understand the importance of the role of regional and external powers in the region. So what happened when the revolution started being militarized was that foreign adversaries were giving justification to act. So they started having a coalition that was too big for the government to defeat. So while Bashar al-Assad was acting in non-conventional ways, using non-conventional ways of deterrence strategies, such as Hezbollah's asymmetric warfare capability and Syrian missiles and so on, the only way to counterbalance this situation was when other powers started participating. So what happens if the United States and Israelis pull out, because we believe that what we have seen so far is that if the United States pull out, NATO follows and regional areas follow, is that this state is going to have enough power to oppress people. Now, EPM says that the option is not either we stay or we have Bashar al-Assad, but this is definitely true, because the only reason why the situation has remained stagnant is because there's an equal situation of power. So when we pull out, they have the most power, they have the capability to start killing their people again, and so on. Let's go up to the second point, the consequences of disengagement. Because we think there are two very important points, economic disengagement and political disengagement. So normally, when we disengage economically with a country, it's because we want to punish them in a certain way. So what we want to happen is for the state to have slower economy so they can do certain things, but also so that the people can pressure them into acting in a certain way. So we believe that this is not what needs to do, because the people are already putting enough pressure on the regime and nothing's changing. But also, in the long term and in a post-conflict situation, we believe this is what's the worst scenario. Because if I pull out and don't have economic ties for you, what are you going to do? You're going to look for other allies. So when Syria looks for other allies, yes, tell me.
But this has already happened. When the United States sanctioned Syria, it just turned towards Russia. Now Russia is its main support.
It's happening partially only, because only the current state is doing so. But if we cut ties completely, even if there's a change in the regime, everyone is going to look up to Russia. Now, we know that if the revolution or the other opposition group win, we still have a place there. If we do what they are saying, we never have a place there. So we completely lose this state. But also when we talk about political engagement, we believe this is a complicated situation, because now we're going to have an authoritarian regime that's supporting terrorism, and this is very negative for the regional stability that we have talked before. Because even if you don't accept the regime, if you are politically engaged with them, you have a certain way of influencing what's going on, and then you can change certain things and situations. But if you completely disengage, then you have full influence in this situation, and we believe in the long term the consequences are worse. So what have we done so far? We have gone broader on the definition of disengaging, which is the fair one that we should be discussing. We have told you why the economic and political disengagement would bring negative consequences, but also how Syrian people would be significantly suffering, because if the only counterbalance to this terrible regime is taken out, then this regime has complete power.
Thank you very much. To close the case for the government, I'd like to welcome Leo.
chair, esteemed panel. All day today, side opposition has tried to hold us to a metric that they themselves are unable to show any solvency that will happen in the status quo. As we have characterized the status quo in the back half of side government especially, is that of a harming stalemate, a hurting stalemate in which there is no possibility to provide for long-term stability in what is happening. And that is the main contribution that the back half has brought. So what I'm going to do for you today is I'm going to take down all of opposition's case, show that it pretty much relies on just a basic premise, and show why we're able to end up winning. Let's begin with side opposition. They have quite a few arguments that you hear out of the leader of opposition that aren't really fully warranted. They're kind of just spit out. They have things such as changing the hearts and minds. Well, they fail to really analyze why it's naturally good for the United States view of the world and their hearts and minds to be influential upon this region, which is something that Tristan uniquely brings you. And they also don't show you how that happens, because we think it happens, what opening tells you, it's actually fueling the fire for radicalization, which has severe impacts. Then they talk about the whole idea of SDF and the fact that al-Assad wants the oil that they are controlling. Well, that just really raises the question that Tristan answers is, why is the United States then supporting SDF and other rebel groups that access that oil, right? It shows that there is that clear incentive for the United States and other Western powers of NATO to try and control the areas in which they're able to access oil, which shows that they're not really having this altruistic look on the region. And we think it's very important that if the United States and NATO don't have stability as their goal, right? If these actors don't have stability as their goal, they are not going to take the adequate measures to try and reach that stability, right? So we don't think that stability is going to happen because stability is not actually the goal of these actors, right? The stability of the goal of these actors is to maintain an influence as long as they can and to have access to oil for as cheap as they can. So we think, yeah.
So if you think oil is like the priority of the United States, then clearly it's in their interest also to keep the area that produces the most oil not in a war zone stable.
Okay, sure. It would be most in their interest to be able to be the ones who are controlling it. And right now, even though it's unstable, they still have access to that control. So they don't really have access to make it any more stable in that. Okay, now let's get a little bit to closing government. I'm trying to find out exactly what it was that they said that was 100% new, except the whole idea that they too assert this main premise that ends up losing their case because they don't prove it, and that is that it becomes more violent when the U.S. pulls out. Right? They just assume, without warrants pretty much, that Assad is going to increase in his violence. However, we see, as Tristan uniquely tells you, that the exact opposite has happened when Assad has that power consolidation. In opening government, they say, well, Assad might not have power. We'll bite the bullet. We'll say Assad will have power. We'll say he'll consolidate that power. That's fine. We think that it's still going to be stable, and he's going to be less violent. Why was he so violent? Why did he commit crimes against humanity, against his own people? Because he wanted the United States to be extremely reactionary. He wanted to be able to do that in the context of the conflict. You remove the conflict that was largely the trigger for these actions. You were also making it less likely for him to commit these extremely heinous and violent acts against his own people. Not yet. And so then they also have this idea that they try and combat. One of our really strong points from closing government is that they say that negotiations are only possible if the U.S. remains. Well, they fundamentally misunderstand the big mechanism we talked to you about on closing government, which is this whole idea that bargaining is only possible when there is something that breaks the level, right? So right now, it seems, or it's perceived as it's pretty much 50-50 in the power, even though in reality Assad has power. So what ends up happening is rebel groups are more likely to take on risky tactics, risky behavior, which is having severe impacts that are on the rebels and on civilians as a whole, and these are some of the impacts that should be prioritized. I'll get to more prioritization later. And also, you're less willing to admit defeat, right? So what are the impacts when you're not willing to admit defeat? Well, the bargaining process as a whole and the peace-building process can't begin. So we think that it's important to admit defeat so you can begin this long-term peace-building process that has the ability to quash rebellions in the future. Also, again, this whole point that Tristan uniquely brings you of moral hazard, right? So if these different rebel groups think that that the U.S. has an obligation, as OO tells you, to support them, they're going to be more likely to rebel in the future. But if the United States says that we are not going to be supporting these rebel groups, then they know that they're not going to have support if they try and rebel, which will de-incentivize rebellion when you're trying to have a more stable state, which is something we think, in the end, is something that is really good. Back half.
The problem with their case is that violence against people didn't start because there was intervention, but because people want their rights. There is no reason for them to stop fighting for what they want and for what they believe in.
Okay, sure, and that's again where you miss our whole analysis, all on the government bench, that right now it's in a hurting stalemate, right? It's not like it's just been 2 years, right? It's happening for 7, almost 8 years now, in which these people have realized that their civilian casualties are only increasing, and also the rebel casualties are only increasing. People are dying even more. What is the impact of a hurting stalemate? It shows that there is not going to be success in that particular goal, right? The initial goals are not going to be succeeded, and they don't show you on their side of the house how under their house they're going to miraculously access better human rights. That's just not something, an impact that they're actually ever able to warrant or flesh out, therefore cannot be prioritized. So let's go over the clash a little bit. So you have the idea, first main clash of this whole thing is regional stability. Right, they don't really show you why this diminishes the chance of future rebellion. On their side, this fight continues, and there's no access to bargaining. When you can't access bargaining, even if the rebels are only able to gain a little bit of their human rights back in order to promise to not rebel in the future, we think that that's a good impact, right? That's a marginal benefit than what you're actually going to be able to accept on their side of the house. And we also show you the negotiation of future rebellion. But let's say even if stability is neutral, right? Either side, no matter what's going to happen, it's going to be unstable. Why should we prioritize the arguments the side governments bring you? We bring you the principle of regional autonomy, right? There's the self-determination that is impossible as long as Western influence are able to still remain when their interests are best at heart are to maintain and to retain as much oil as they can in Western influence. We think that if Assad takes power, then in the long term, you are only able to have regional autonomy if you actually pull out your influence and allow people to self-determine and allow people to use their newly accessed bargaining power to be able to achieve at least more human rights than they had before Assad came, and that's why we win. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To finish round 8 at World University Main Championship, I'd like to welcome the opposition leader.
Okay, so first the rebuttal, because OJ said bring 2 arguments. The first one is about the detrimental consequences of still engaging with Syria, because the main objectives are almost achieved, but USA continues to funding rebels groups, increasing the violence. 2 main points to rebut this argument. Disengage in this particular time of history only increases the possibility of violence because there are 2 main scenarios. The first scenarios are that these groups use the resources they already have and keep attacking everything to achieve all their goals, because we don't believe that it's probably that they give up on their fight because their objectives are not achieved at this time. But also that the second scenario is that probably Russia will take advantage of the existence of these kind of groups and starts to fund these groups. So it's better to continue the engage of the United States to guarantee a disarm process to the rebel groups, because otherwise instability will really happen and will be harder and with more violence than in the status quo. So it's good to engage in this time, because if the main objectives are already achieved or almost achieved, it's good to have a player that has guarantees to start a process to disarm all the actors in this kind of conflicts. Also, the second argument is about alternatives are a better way to achieve these goals. But alternatives have more chances to succeed if we have a credible threat to support the claims of the people and support the claims of the rebels. So if USA disengage to Syria, any possible threat that could lose credibility in the negotiations process, So the platform to negotiate will be weaker on the side of the rebels and will be stronger on the side of the regime. So alternatives only works in our side of the debate when we have credible threats and we have the presence of the United States to support that kind of threats. So CE have the argument about conflict because information failures. But if that is the main source of conflict, information failures will be more frequent and more dangerous if USA disengage, because there is only one player that will control the sources of information, the sources that will have more useful tips to the army forces, and we have only one side of the story telling what is happening in Syria. So we believe that these information failures are better attended in the outside when the United States is engaging in Syria. But we believe that actually the moral hazards on making some risky gambling actions is harder and it's more dangerous in the government side of the debate, because the moral hazard is higher when we are putting people in more risk, because disengagement also implies making that people more vulnerable than in the status quo. So we believe that the real moral hazard is putting the people in more danger and a situation that will long a more time than if United States continues disengagement. And finally, about the point of solvency in the long term, MO brought in distinction 2 points about the political and economic consequences of disengage Syria. We believe that this impact will have a very long-term solvency to support what is happening in Syria rather than to disengage that kind of actions. Because people is not going to give on their fight, but if we disengage that kind of goals, that people will be on their own, there will be alone fighting against an oppressive and authoritarian regime, and fighting also against the support of Russia to that regime. So we believe that this is more important to have solvency in the long term.
Okay, so the fact is, when it isn't clear who's going to win, each side have incentives to demonstrate their comparative power. In the case of an authoritarian regime, that means that Assad has greater incentive to harm his civilians.
I understand the point. But if these two parts have the same incentives to show their power, why is a good reason to decrease our power and our presence in that region, letting all the power to one side of the conflict and letting the people in a vulnerable situation? We believe that that is not a good thing. So what we talked in the in CO side is that engagement is not only about participation in military issues, but on any kind of economic and political issues in order to gain stability and to achieve well-being to persons living in Syria. So first, the role of regional and external powers is important because United States have a lot of influence in the international community. So if United States decides to disengage Syria, this is probably other actors with a huge importance and influence, like NATO, like other countries that are allies to the United States, will follow the same path and will abandon on their own to the Syrian people. So this is important because right now this present is a counterbalance to the conflict, and this counterbalance will lose power and effectiveness to fight against oppression and to end and to end Assad the conflict. And the second point that brought in the extension is about the consequences of disengagement, because it's not necessary to put some sanctions or this kind of mechanism, because people are already putting pressure of the government. So it's important that people will have first economic possibility to move on a post-conflict situation, because economic allies are also important to move on this kind of conflicts when you are in a post-conflict situation. If United States disengage on this kind of issues, people will have a harder time to move on economic failures and challenges. but also the political issues, because in the long term it will be harder to take down the regime if this maintained, because United States gave up the possibility to make a change on that situation. So how we differentiate with OO? We talked about other important spheres of engagement, not only about military engagement, and we bring consequences to Syria and its people in two broad spheres of political and economic issues, so proud to oppose.
Cool, thank you very much. Please cross the floor, shake hands, say nice things, buddy.